I want to discuss some issues surrounding the analysis of longitudinally collected composite patient outcomes, and especially spend time comparing some methods that may be used for analyzing such data. First, analytical overview. Many sponsors are using low power methods. The lowest power method that we have is responder analysis, when you reduce rich longitudinal, continuous, or ordinal data down into a binary outcome. This is always highly not recommended because it loses an amazing amount of power, but it's a very tragic occurrence when we see sponsors using responder analysis in rare disease. So if you ever wanted to minimize power, that's a way to do it. Power can be gained a number of ways. One is by not having a binary outcome. So adding more resolution to an outcome scale, more distinct values, either continuous or ordinal with several categories. You can gain power further by using multiple scales if you know how to combine them. And then you can gain power further by using longitudinal data. So of all the things we do in clinical trials, the most high power outcomes are typically longitudinal data with many visits and a continuous outcome. Now, there is a complication, especially in serious diseases, that you must take into account death and other clinical events. Otherwise, it can be hard to interpret the results, or it can be biased if you sweep deaths under the rug. So the first kinds of options I'm going to discuss, and this is very brief, is the win ratio or win odds and DOOR, desirability of outcome ranking. Win ratio, odds, and DOOR are extensions of the Wilcoxon two-sample test, and they gain power by breaking ties in time to event outcomes so that you have more than just a binary event, but you can use, say, death and various measurements or other events. The disadvantage of these methods that I think a lot of clinical trialists don't recognize is they provide only a within study estimate. There's no clinical scale readouts, no estimates on a clinical scale. So you're essentially estimating the Wilcoxon concordance probability, which is the probability that a randomly chosen patient on treatment B has a better outcome than a randomly chosen patient on treatment A. The question is how much better? And it also is very desirable in whatever method you're using to be able to state the outcome summary for one treatment at a time. So what is the outcome of patients on treatment B? You can't really get that from win and DOOR. This is especially an issue when you have more than two treatments and you'd like to make a summary of all the treatments separately before you decide which treatments to compare pairwise. Now, the relative ordering estimate is influenced by the narrowness of the study inclusion criteria. And so how much variation you have in the patients enrolled can affect the estimate that you get because it's just a relative estimate. So this is analogous to doing a two-sample t-test and reporting the t ratio, the t statistic, but not reporting the numerator difference in means, which is the clinical readout. Also, with win and DOOR, it's very difficult to deal with missing component data, and it's very difficult to do covariate adjustment. The next method I want to talk about is ordinal longitudinal models, which is what we have spent so much time at Vanderbilt University in my department, especially with applicability to the multiple COVID therapeutic trials we have led. Ordinal longitudinal models, or OLM, are extensions of the Wilcoxon test, also extensions of the Cox proportional hazards model that allow covariate adjustment and repeated measures. The most flexible form of OLMs uses a Markov process because that is the most flexible way to model the correlation structure of the longitudinal patient assessments. As an aside, we find that the correlation structure assumed by random effects models do not fit the clinical trials in which we examine the correlation structure, whereas the Markov process is more a serial correlation type of correlation structure. And we find that it fits the clinical trial data, all the data sets we've examined amazingly well. The OLM has been, with the Markov process, has been studied in great detail, and we've also done a lot of simulation studies. I'm finding a lot of statisticians analyzing longitudinal clinical trial data are not producing variograms and other diagnostics to check the correlation structure. And one of the things that's underappreciated in statistics in some quarters is that you need to model the intra-patient correlation structure as the best you can, because that has a lot to do with getting accurate standard errors of the treatment effect and getting the highest effective sample size. So the more accurate you model that correlation structure, the higher the effective sample size, and that will increase the power. OLMs very elegantly handle missing components, and they do that with interval censoring and other methods. And they're really the method that formally handle absorbing states such as death or some sort of permanent rescue therapy, something that interrupts the flow. And so if you have an absorbing state and you can't measure a patient's scale because of that, you can get into counterfactuals and all sorts of unobservables. But with a Markov process and ordinal longitudinal model, you can handle that very elegantly, and you're accounting for death and the need for rescue therapy very, very explicitly. There's a huge variety of clinical readouts with OLMs, which is one of its biggest advantages. So, for example, you could estimate the probability of transitioning to a certain state, Y2. This state could be that you're moderately symptomatic or whatever you want to define for that state. At time T2, given you were in another state, Y1 at T1. So you can estimate what's the probability of going from being at home to requiring hospitalization as you go from one time period to another. You can also estimate the probability of being at a certain severity or worse as a function of time and treatment, which is one of our key things of interest. You can calculate the estimate of the mean time in any set of states, and you can take differences in those mean times, and the treatment difference in the expected time in specified states is like a difference in the mean time to recovery or the mean time to loss of function. This is also related to restricted mean survival time. So this generalizes the Wilcoxon test. It generalizes the Cox model. It handles time-dependent covariates if you need it. It contains recurrent event analysis as a special case and longitudinal analysis. So the OLMs, one reason that I feel so strongly that they should be seriously considered is they're a unifying theme. You don't keep learning special cases over and over. This applies to very simple univariate outcomes as well as more complex longitudinal studies as well as time-to-event studies. This is one of the most popular readouts that really helps you interpret the results of an ordinal longitudinal model. This is for a study where there were 4 different outcome levels. Being at home, which is the lower bar here, is the best outcome state. And then you have the other states going up all the way to death. And you're showing the probability at any day of being in a given state, and you can sum the heights of those bars to calculate the probability of being, let's say, in the best 2 states. And so these are just ordinary probabilities, and you can compare treatments this way, and you can sum probabilities to give expected time in state. OLMs work for treatments that improve patient conditions as well as for treatments that slow progression. There's a detailed case study at this address, and so this gives a lot of background information a complete R code, complete analysis, and interpretation. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. OB, Office of Biostatistics, is doing a project currently of reanalyzing an ALS trial using OLM. I think this will be an excellent opportunity to learn more about the use of OLM in degenerative rare disease settings. Now, a relatively new method is the time savings method. There's some parts of the method that date back just a year or two before this, but this is a key reference by Dixon et al. In 2023. This analyzes either a single composite outcome measure or can use statistical summaries of separate measures. It's intended to be used for degenerative disease, not for treatments that improve patients over their baseline state. It assumes the follow-up time is sufficiently long that almost all the control group patients fare very poorly. Time savings method is essentially T sub A minus T sub C. So A stands for active treatment and C is for control, where T sub A is the time at the end of the study for actively treated patients. TC is the time by which the control patients do as poorly as active patients at T sub A. So this is based on linear interpolation on estimated means. It cannot account for death or the need for rescue therapy. Some comparisons. OLM assumes that you have a consensus in a severity ordering of the outcome states for a single assessment time. Other methods may assume that too, but OLM, it's a definite assumption. And by default, OLM uses only the worst conditions suffered by the patient on a given day. If you have certain conditions that co-occur on a given day or week or month, whatever your time period, you can make a new category for the co-occurrence, and that category would be worse than either of the individual occurrences. You expect the OLMs to have greater power than TS because it makes more use of the raw data over the entire time course. It accounts for how close to failure the active arm patients were before the last follow-up. So in general, any statistical method that can take into account close calls is going to extract more information from the data and increase the power. OLM allows for an absorbing state or terminating event that precludes patient scale assessment. It explicitly accounts for death in an interpretable fashion. And if you want to contrast that with the kind of counterfactual thinking that some people use, and also contrast it with competing risk analysis is actually very difficult to interpret. And it has a hidden proportional odds assumption, which is surprising to a lot of statisticians. Those methods are much harder to interpret than the result you get from, say, a state transition model like we usually use with OLM. TS cannot easily borrow information, although I think it's possible, but OLM has been implemented fully both in the frequentist and in Bayesian models. And OLM is sort of unique over all methods in that it provides a way to formally assess the consistency of treatment effects across different outcome components on your overall ordinal scale. Now, there are several issues that are interesting to study about composite outcome scales. Of course, the choice of scales is very important, and the sensitivity to the disease process, the importance of what the scale is measuring to the patient. I would argue that the gold standard for how outcomes should be analyzed when outcomes are varied and there's several possible outcomes is to do patient utility analysis. This could be a formal time trade-off experiment done outside of the clinical trial where you get utilities assigned to each outcome state and you just analyze the utilities as a continuous variable or an ordinal variable over time to see which treatment gives the best utilities. The OLM approach is approximating the gold standard. And so I think without having to do the utility study, but to have outcome categories that are ranked in utility order, it is mimicking the gold standard method. Now, when you have multiple scales, as the time savings advocates discuss at length, if you know how to combine them, you can increase your power. The interpretation may sometimes get a little bit more difficult. Now, one approach that's used in the time savings paradigm is global statistical summary. This just one example of that is like doing a rank of an outcome, and then you rank the other outcome from 1 to n, and you average those ranks within patient and analyze those average ranks instead of ordinary ranks on a single outcome measure. That's just one of many, many ways to get a global statistical summary. The problem is these summaries are not clinically interpretable at a given time. They cannot handle deaths, and they have some difficulty in handling missing component data. Now, this link will get you to an elaboration of what I've overviewed in these slides. I go into some detail about some options for creating summaries of multiple scales, including calibrating several scales to one anchor scale and other approaches. And I give more of the comparisons of different methods and a little bit more background about the various statistical approaches. So I hope you find this useful. I look forward to discussing some of these issues with you in the coming weeks.